Greg Drevinstead, Editor-in-Chief at Rider Magazine, and your host for the Rider Magazine Insider Podcast. Our guest on episode 48 is Dave Scott, who made a solo journey on the TransAmerica Trail. This is part 2 of a 3-part interview. We spoke to Scott on episode 46, where he told us about the challenges of just getting started on the TransAmerica Trail. He dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic, difficulties shipping his KTM from Louisiana to North Carolina, and riding his luggage-laden bike through a hurricane and on wet, mud-slick trails. In episode 46, Scott had gotten as far as the Mississippi River. In this episode, we pick up where we left off, and Scott shares his adventures in the Ozarks, the Great Plains, and the Rocky Mountains, where he faced the biggest challenge of the trip. Try as I might to keep the conversation going, Scott is a force of nature, blowing through the interview like a Category 5 hurricane. He's like Doug the dog in the animated Pixar movie Up, who mid-conversation will say, "Squirrel," and get sidetracked. This is another freewheeling, uncensored conversation full of humor, tangents, side stories, and insightful observations about what it's like to ride solo across America on a dirt bike. During our interview, Scott was on the deck of his house overlooking Lake Pontchartrain in Louisiana. The interview came to an abrupt end when the sun overheated his phone and it died. I probably wouldn't have been able to bring the conversation to a close otherwise. Stay tuned for part 3, where I hope we'll get the end of Scott's epic tale of adventure. And look for Scott's story in the November 2022 issue of Rider. It's an adventure-themed issue with stories about the TransAmerica Trail, the Trans-Canada Adventure Trail, the Trans-Europe Trail, the White Rim Trail, and much more. Enjoy the episode.
Yeah, so I guess
we're live, dude. Well, we're recording at least.
Yeah, God. Okay, that's what that screen was. Yeah, so I guess we kind of left off around the Mississippi or whatever, and I was heading on route to meet a buddy of mine, Rick Koch. Recall, I did this, started in Cape Hatteras, got chased by the storm, had a lot of water and a lot of trail damage because at that summer was 2 summers ago, there was 5 named storms hit Louisiana, and in fact, I think we ran out of names. And the last one that creamed me was a week after Halloween, which is even after, and it was Zeta. So that means they ran through all the names and then hit all the Greek names. And so a beta and a zeta creamed us. But anyway, all that was happening in American southeast part of the United States. And so there was a lot of water crossings. And finally, I got sandwiched in between 2 named hurricanes in Mississippi and just got caught in a bunch of sludge. So emerge out of that, and then weirdly, I guess I just front loaded all the weather because I had sunny weather for a month for the rest of my trip, basically, although I'll talk a little bit later. But anyway, so then the other thing is most of the trip I'd done by myself, but I had a buddy of mine that lives outside of St. Louis that has another KT. Actually has my old adventure, the one I was going to try to sell you, but he ended up with it. And it's a 640. It's the original. It's an amazing bike. I rode that thing 2 up with Suze from Colorado to Nevada, all off-road 2 up on that thing. So, and then rode all the way back through New Orleans and back to DC on that thing. So it's a good bike. It's a solid platform, blah, blah. Anyway, so on the Arkansas part of the TAT, and some guys only do Arkansas, and I met some guys coming on the trail or whatever. There's a little group of 5 guys that were just doing the Arkansas TAT, and it's interesting. It's its own thing, and again, you could run features on Arkansas. And it was also different for me it was the first and only time that I had another guy to ride with. And maybe a little aside on that, and we'll go back to the main trail story or whatever. But it's interesting on philosophies. It's not like one of these, beau gestes, je regrette rien, je marche seul, I'm just doing this by myself, screw the world, I hate people, no, at all, I kind of hope to have a bunch of people get it together back in the planning stages, but life things and that COVID went on for a whole nother year, and a lot of people can take a week off and maybe a weekend with etc. And at the end of the day, it was like, I just want to do this. But then once I started to do it, there was a joy in making your own time, your time schedules, pushing it a little harder, skipping lunches, all of those kind of things that were, you could only control your experience and then your sense of accomplishment. And then motorcycling in general is what I call that helmet time, where it's introspective and there's a whole bunch of little problem solutions that sounds exhausting to some people, but maybe like doing a crossword puzzle. It's like a challenge and a completion and all of those things. It's nice by yourself. And indeed, as cool as Rick was, and then fun having the shared experience. Oh, and I started there was a factory flaw that I think they fixed, but that whole trip, I always had problem with my rear brake. And doesn't really matter all that much on a motorcycle. What, 80% of the stopping power, whatever, is the front, and those dual disc brakes on that KTM are awesome. However, going on hills, especially downhills, fully loaded with my 200 and something pound carcass on top of it, is kind of nice to have a back brake. Because even in first gear, the engine brake, or such as that thing is, and do you need a $10,000 brake? No, called your engine, but you're still going 20 miles an hour on some of these sliding scree switchbacks. That's pretty fast. That's a lot faster than I want to be going. And even thinking about your front brake, it means you're going to tuck the front end and face plant on a cactus. And then so having a back brake is a useful activity. And then if you tighten, I went from no brake, and if you tighten it where you can feel the brake, then blue smoke comes out of the back, and it's white hot sizzle. And that happened 2 or 3 times on that damn Arkansas part of it. And having another dude around for that was absolutely awesome. And thank you, God, and thank you, Jesus, for being my personal savior to bring Rick Koch out there to help me unfuck my brakes every time I come over. And so that was kind of, there's the aspect of it that the photos show and the joy in the countryside. But in terms of just like technical trail, the rest of Arkansas was pretty. It was fairly well marked. And there's one famous thing that's the tat killer for a lot of people. And just now I was going to say it and I forgot. It's a one little road. It's a long story, but that one at the time, because of the flooding and rain, it was actually taped off. And so we did a little workaround, and we saw a bunch of elk during the workaround. So again, that's one of those where I think God smiled on that. And then the workaround also included this killer pie place, and biking and food kind of go together. The Orc store is another fun one. Anyway, when the one thing about having another partner too is, as we had talked about in the other podcast, is that my trip was a little bit kinetic insofar as mostly 80% of it I stuck with Sam Carrero's TAT, but there's this GPS Kevin's map, and there's this backcountry discovery route, and then in Colorado and in a couple of other places, it was Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears did go through Arkansas, and so I try to follow some of that. It ended right there in Oklahoma. In fact, I took the Trail of Tears that actually paralleled or was contiguous with Sam's to get into Oklahoma. So there was a lot of, Best Barbecue and all of these little separate routes. I was trying to, Spock chess, multitask doing this thing, and as a compromise. Well, then you add Rick Koch, where this was his backyard, mostly on a street bike. And it was, once a year thing that he goes down there. And so he wants to do the, what does they call that? The pigtail. And they have all these sort of like tail the dragon little, in fact, the state commission comes out with a little map that has like 6 or 7 bike routes on there. And one of them's an enduro one. Also, because the water had been high because of all those storms, we took a day off and went kayaking, whitewater kayaking for a day. And I recommend everyone throughout the TAT 2 or 3 times minimum, if not like every other day, is you're going through some of the most amazing country on the planet. And you'd just be a jackass to just blast through there in the middle of the night, like who does that? But apparently, remember those kids in Tennessee do that, where it's like a race for them, and they're hitting 70 miles an hour. And I guess that's their own trip. But for me, taking advantage of some of the things Arkansas has to do. The other neat thing about Arkansas, a couple of neat things that's unique on the TAT that made it, top 10 or top 5 is there's a cool dude in the mountains in the central part of Arkansas / Ozarks that has a little trailer that has running water, hot water, a refrigerator, and it's open for free to anyone in the TAT. And you just come in, and when we had it all to ourselves, and it's pretty bare, bunk bed kind of thing. And we put sleeping bags on the mattress and, clean it all up. And so the Tat Shack is a pretty groovy, cool thing. That's just, it's super, super neat. And then there's another one in the beginning before I drove up with Rick, where there's an old guy where the road, a lot of these roads actually go through farms. And you're like, dang, there's a barn on one side and the guy's house on the other. And you're kind of going through his driveway. There's chickens and stuff. And so again, you got to be respectful in all of this, and GPS Kevin's has too much of that, and sometimes he doesn't have the landowner's permission. So that's a major caveat. And I ran into that in Oklahoma and I felt really bad, but the people were real friendly. Actually, what the guy did was once he got wind after a couple of years of all these fucking dirt bikes going through his cornfield, is he replowed it. So now you can tell is right when you get off the road on GPS's Kevin's, there's a huge cornfield. And unless you're going to go through the ruts of this guy's cornfield, it's purposely planted diagonally across where the trail is to make sure that like everyone got the hint. And I talked to his wife in the driveway when I turned around and said, hey, I'm sorry, because she was watching me watering the lawn. And she said, oh, yeah, somebody did some motorcycle and you people come through here. And then from then on, that was the last I ever touched GPS, as I felt pretty contrite. But I just took that one because it goes through Kansas and I wanted to add another state. Anyway, so I guess we're in Oklahoma now. This part of the story. And
so I mean, so basically, I mean, I've only ridden on some of the roads like you were talking about the pig trail and stuff. I've only done one pass through the Ozarks on a cross country trip. Fantastic street riding. I've always heard the dirt bike, dual sporting is great there. So you're coming out of the mountains, and then once you leave the Ozarks and get out of Arkansas, then you're basically into the plains, and so it flattens out.
Well, no, not really. Actually, there's a whole, again, who knew? I'm a born and raised, half a century plus living in the great United States. But there's big corners of this country that you think you kind of know. And eastern and northeastern Oklahoma is rocky, wooded. There's some river crossings. It's a little bit reminiscent of Tennessee, actually.
Oh, wow. Cool.
And then even where that crossing, where the Trail of Tears / Sam's route, you don't know you're in it's one of the few where I didn't get a welcome to, some kind of a sign. It was, right. I just crossed onto this pavement and there was this little strip mall. And then they had and that's the other thing is that Oklahoma is a whole confederation of independent nations, of tribal nations. It's got some of the most indigenous people in the U.S. and they have their own license plates and they have their own flags and they have a large degree of self-autonomy, at least from an outsider. I don't know what it's like in real life if some Bantustan or some, I don't know. I don't get political on it, but, and so there, and then the other stupid thing is, yeah, I know all the flags of America kind of, sort of, but could you tell the difference, you as a Westerner / New Orleanian, I know from is that, Iowa versus Michigan, unless when you're in the state, well, Iowa says Iowa on it. So you kind of give you a guess. Well, the Oklahoma one, I kind of, I guess, forgot what it was. And then there was tribal. So it wasn't until I was in some little strip mall and I saw this flag. And that's when I'm like, Toto, you're not in Arkansas anymore. But yeah. So, but the one kind of finally thing about Arkansas is that, so my buddy, it became kind of a struggle and the way I looked at it was, this is my trip, man. And it's nice that you're sharing this with me, but I'm going all the way to Port Orford, Oregon. And I got a lot of miles. So in terms of some radical shit, I got to be a little bit more conservative, but also he had a buddy of his, and this I reviewed a little bit because I can visualize these places, but the names escape me. But there's a kind of a neat little town that's right on the Missouri border. And he had a buddy of his that ran a motel and we could stay there for free. And then he left there. And then it was also closer to home for him to go home on that dirt bike. Whereas it took me, I figured it out, almost 200 miles out of my way to do sort of compromise what Rick wanted to do versus what I wanted to do. And at the end, it was kind of a wash where I was really excited about having another person with me. When I was finally on my own, hitting Oklahoma, doing my historical trail part 2, I was kind of happy that I was back on the road and back on track and back heading towards Oregon. And again, a way different mindset than I started the whole trip with, where I'm doing this, I'm finishing it, my bike. Oh, and then also the one good thing about Rick taking me out of the way was I had to do a little bit of slabbing, and I went to this other kind of a regional KTM dealership. And again, I should have it to do a shout out to like really good people. What's the town where the headquarters of Walmart is?
Bentonville.
What's that?
Bentonville.
Yeah, it's like, I think it's Bentonville KTM, or it's the only one in there. They actually have another product that they sell there too, I think, and side by sides. But great dealership, really big. And the other cool thing is this one mechanic, was rare for these places, took me in the back actually with his tools and had me sit down and show me how to play with that brake. And really, and I'm mechanical Neanderthal. I suck at, I'm banging the stick next to the obelisk and throwing the bone in the air is about, as good as I could do from, so not only did they pretty much fix those brakes, and plus a lot of fear and just riding brakes all the time. I didn't want to use the throttle. I thought the brake could propel me forward or keep my plunging down or whatever. It was all brakes all the time. And of course I cooked them, but those hits, yeah, man, it was pretty sensitive for that kind of shit. Anyway, Oklahoma. So Oklahoma was beautiful. It was very gradual, how it turned to plains and from farmland and then to the deep plains. And by the time you get to the panhandle, and then I got a little bit of rain, and that rivaled Mississippi. It's a different color. It's kind of a gray-black mud. Yeah. But the interesting thing about Oklahoma, since it was actually laid out to be a state in the 20th century, is the entire state is grids. And there's like 1/5 of those are paved. And so whether you want Sam's route or GPS Kevin's route or any other bloody freaking route, is where it's raining, don't go to that grid square where it's not, and you can see it. That's the neat thing about central to western Oklahoma is you can see the weather a couple hours ahead of you and figure it out, and even if you're not from there, give it 2 days and you'll figure it out. And so what I did was just make my own tat completely on dirt roads. Again, the whole time I'm trying to, these other little trails is the spirit of the tat. And that's what Rick and I bounced heads a little bit on, was he was happy to do twisty paved roads because he has an enduro. But to me, it's like the point of the tat is driving across America on dirt roads. I mean, I can come back with my victory and have and will to do the other shit. Anyway, so and so that was actually neat too. So I was a little bit further south than what either of those trails, and I would just recommend anyone else to take that route anyway, because there's the Cimarron River, and that starts, and there's these sand dunes, and there's this salt flat area that's next to southern Louisiana, and Florida is the largest avian flyover thing. And so a lot of interesting things to see. And then again, one of the top 5 coolest things that ever happened was I went to this sand dune thing. And separate story with outside of motorcycling is I got lost. And the Spanish, who was it? De Vaca or somebody in 15 something, insane, sent his conquistadors wandering around Oklahoma. I mean, they kind of never really came back, left a presence. But in his journal, he lost 15 men in the sand dune thing, and that they got lost. He sent another party, and they got lost, and then he sent a third party, including his main lieutenant. Was that we need to get these guys back because one of them was their chef.
I lost you, Dave.
I went back in the camera. And I thought, I just read this historical article about all these people getting lost. Like, what do I do all by myself with no GPS and no flashlight, wander around? So then when I got back into town, it turns out the next day in Beaver, Oklahoma, one of the coolest communities in all of the 50 states and half dozen territories and regions, is that had their cow chip. The international cow chip throwing competition was in Beaver the weekend that I was there. How cool was that? And really cool community. And then from there is an area of the United States called No Man's Land, that after when Texas was a state and some of these others, this was this area where that's why that weird panhandle was, where no state had any jurisdiction. And that lasted, again, almost to the 20th century. And then that was where all of these Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and all of these cowboy. And so there's all these remote trails. And so therefore, too, is who would have thought that the westernmost part of Oklahoma and that panhandle is physically and historically one of the most interesting. In fact, I took another day and a half there, and I stopped early at a little state. The very last is Black Rock State Park, and I climbed Black Rock Mountain, which is the highest point in Oklahoma. It's like 10,000 feet. It's a hell of a height. It took like all day. That's why I reserved a day. And from there, you can see all through the basin, and then you're in Colorado, and then the west, like you're in so there's prairie, but then boom, when you're in Oklahoma looking you're now in the west, and you can see those mountains, and that's when it got real. That's like, wow. Yeah. And mentally, like, I'm halfway to the Mississippi. Nah, you're really like a third of the way. Yeah. But once you're in the west, you're like, I'm halfway, and then you think all those adventures behind you, it's going to be more coming up, like heavier, like this is real. All that messing around with brakes, all that learning how to cross rivers, all that crap was like training. Yeah. And I guess some guys start there, but man, I kind of needed, like, I had about a month in, at that point, because I messed around on some of them days. And then I had my uncle lives there in Raton, so I pulled off the tat a little bit, and visited. The cousin drove 3 hours to visit me. And that was like a great reunion, great reboost. And a lot of people get tires in Trinidad and Tupac place. And Trinidad's a good place to stock up and get your shit together if you're missing camping stuff and do all those things. And then Colorado was physically beautiful. The weather changed. Of course, I was higher altitude, and poof, overnight the aspens turned it was cool. One day they were green, and it was the first night where there was frost on my tank. In fact, on the little plastic where the map thing goes, which had kind of turned yellow. So I was using the Garmin most of the time, but I'd stuff maps in there that I could just look when I was straddling the bike at neutral, trying to, the one thing about the Garmin is it's pretty accurate, but it's accurate within 200 to 350 feet. Well, shit, there could be 3 trails branching out in that little grid square, and it doesn't show. And even if you're on the wrong one, it'll show you're on the right one until you get, another 500 or half a click away. And so it's good to have paper maps all the time. And also, too, is studying the routes. Once stuff closes, sure, you can go little on your garden with your face pressed up against it, but you need a bigger map to look at a proper workaround. Yeah. And a couple of times I did workarounds on workarounds and shit. If you're not marking a map at that point, dude, you can get majorly lost. And anyway, so Colorado came up, and it was better and prettier. And then I crossed the divide, and it turns out the divide is interesting, but they're pretty conservative, wide, big roads and everything. But it wasn't until I was almost out of Colorado, and it was those what do they call them? The what's that group of mountains where Telluride and Waray and Lake
the San Juans.
San Juans. Thank you. Santa Cristo is the ones you enter with, and then there's Rockies, and then the San Juans, and all 3 are different, interesting. And those last ones, though, that's where the cover shots are made. That's where it's just that is a unique, amazing, and I can't stress this enough, extraordinarily challenging. I was way out of my element. And similar to I said in the Mississippi, you don't know you're out of your element until you're out of your element, and and the story in your magazine has more of the Colorado part. And so I won't give the details of those last couple of days. But anyway, coming over, I did Engineer Pass. And at the stop of Engineer Pass, right when I went to, straddling the bike to take a selfie, I almost got blown over. I mean, it had been gale force winds. That's what, 90 mile an hour winds. And it was and the rain it turned into sleet that turned into snow instantly. I mean, the time that it took me to come up to the top, the cloud went around the side of the thing and went from sunny to like pea soup fog while I'm still taking my gloves and helmet, to this rain wind crap, to a complete whiteout. Yeah. And and the snow was coming up. That was a weird thing. It wasn't going down or sideways. It's blowing straight up, like the wind is coming to the canyon. And that was a hell of a thing, getting down this incredible. It looked like years ago, doing things during the war in Afghanistan, the mountains between Pakistan and the Karakoram Mountains, and this area looked like that, where it's denuded of any kind of foliage, and it's just this rock and like glacier and complete whiteout. And since it was a popular weekend and tons of people with side by sides, some of my best friends drive side by sides, however, is Tennessee, Arkansas, and the Ozarks. And this lake loop area is it's even some of the locals are talking about how they need to maybe do a quota. Is that there's a lot of those things. Not a lot of people. Now, on the positive side, is it handicapped people and older people I saw up there could access the mountains? And I thought, really neat. I ran into this old couple that were poking around this mine, and I thought she was kind of on a walker. And I thought, here's a gal that would never get to experience this stuff if it weren't for the side-by-side. So I get that, and ranchers and all of those, and I'm a yahoo that's messing around. I'm a tourist too, but water crossings, God, in Tennessee, these clubs would get there and just cross the same thing back and forth, playing in the mud. And that turns into a trough. And in the Colorado one, there was a lot of people that were way above their skill level too, like skis. Like, there's always that 9-year-old kid that like blasts into the top of you on a mount when you're trying to ski and breaks your leg, and and he's rubber and keeps going. And there was a lot of close calls with these
Yeah, but I mean,
side
'cause
by
you
side.
can rent side by sides, but you don't really need to know what you're doing. I mean, if you can drive a car, people drive side by sides, and so you have people that don't have many skills, don't have much understanding of trail etiquette, and then you have some people that are just ripping on those things. So yeah, and they take up a lot of space on a trail. So it creates challenges for motorcyclists. I'm sure it even creates challenges for people in Jeeps and stuff because those guys, I've seen them in Moab just ripping through trails, and it's kind of a pain. So
Yeah. Yep. And a lot of drinking. I mean, not a lot, probably 5% or 1% of those two, but there's like people just doing stupid shit like that. Yes. And also, too, and this will feature later on in our little talk or whatever, is that it was dry. It has been dry. El Nino, global warming, global weirding, I don't know, whatever, all those things. Is that but it's super dry. And a lot of the locals were saying, oh man, just heavy use Jeeps, motorcycles, and side by sides, but just seems like there's a lot more side by sides. But with the dryness, it's just ripping up the trail. A lot of, especially people that don't know what they're doing,
yeah.
or there's one little mud and there's workaround. And so there was lots and lots of visible trail erosion. And I would opine that on some of these tats and backdoor, a backcountry discovery route, that's what I actually took leaving from Pagosa Springs. I left kind of Sam's and took all the way into Utah. The backdoor discovery route is the one that I took. And then in the Lake District, in that little town of Lake City, that's called one of the most remote towns in the United States. It's like 2.5. They base it on how long it takes you to get somewhere, but in the sort of eastern central part of those mountains is this little town called Lake City, and they have a really neat museum in there because it's famous for this guy Edward Packer that was a cannibal that during the cowboy. And who's those guys, Trey and whatever the guys that do
South Park, Trey
South
Stone
Park,
and Matt Parker, I think. Yeah.
yes, their college project, and it's worth finding on the internet because you can find it, is there's this musical called Cannibal about this guy Alfred Packer. Anyway, there's a museum about him in all these little towns, and so I kind of followed the Alfred Packer route to the Cannibal area. There's a little thing in there, but they have a map in there, and so I used that map to my extreme detriment because at least on the backcountry discovery and on Kevin's and stuff, is they have like a green, sort of like skiing. There's like the black route, the green route, or whatever. But the little lake map just has all these really cool trails, and it's mostly like where they go and all this. So I'm like, oh yeah, I want to see the waterfall, and then I want to see this mine, and I'm going to follow this trail, and it's more local, so it's just like one kind of big grid square, and I was put that on my tank bag. And of course, Colorado people are really demure. I mean, I guess when they live there, and unlike other, of course, Texas is famous for its braggadocio, and California is cool, and New Yorkers are stereotyped about, the browbeaten, mouthy New York minute or whatever. And I just found Coloradoans, of some of whom are my cousins, just like pretty accepting and just very, like I said, hey, how hard is this road? And they kind of look, you try to get intel on these things, and they see your motorcycle and they just assume you're like them that ride to school every day through glaciers and, ravines and so on. And so I never had anyone tell me, oh, you better be careful. They're usually really encouraging and say, yeah, go for it, And so with this local map and so it was awful, actually. I got myself into, it was just, please God, get me out of these things. And, so I made it off of Engineer Pass after that blizzard, and the backside of Engineer, because the way the map does is there's a loop and it goes back through. And so most people rent these side by side, start in Lake City and then end in Lake City, or they can go, there's like a couple of little hubs. There's like a campground area. But in my case, I saw on this little map and then I looked on the backcountry discovery route, albeit it was a little red one, but the red was only like 2 miles or something. And I think, well, even if it's like a cliff, I could just slide for 2 miles and it's fine. Those are like 2 miles of the most terrifying moments of my life, and it took me like 2 hours to do those like 2 miles. It was awful and horrible, and I don't ever want to do it again. And then, so I made it into Waray, and Waray has this really awesome hot springs, like public pool. I recommend go out of your way to go to this place. It's street bike. And if you're on a street bike, is that $1 Million Mile? That's actually where Sam's, it's pavement on that part, but it's listed on the top 10 great roads of all time, and all of these things. And it's challenging, even the pavement. And hence why I thought, I'm going back to backcountry discovery in this little local Colorado enduro map, and so I that's why I didn't follow Sam's, because it went way around and I wanted to go through all these mining towns. However, so you're pretty sore. So my point is, another high point on the Tat is just, it's like $5. It comes with a locker and a shower, all things that I needed because I've been camping, and just soaked in this hot tub pool for as long as I needed. And there was a little sprinkling that night, which is kind of fun to be in the rain and hot springs. And the whole town uses that place because it's a little town, actually. And so it was 90% locals. And then I really got to get some good intel on the road ahead, because I just finished Engineering Pass, and then I was going to go up Imogene Pass. And I wanted to go to Imogene Pass because it's the third highest navigable pass in the hemisphere. And I'm like, yeah. And it's like the second one in like Colorado, and it's at 14,000 feet. And I must say I had a little bit of, machismo or something. And I said, oh, I'm doing that. That's going to be the tallest, the highest. I'm doing this. And so I asked a lot of people, and everyone's like, well, and they're the ones that were first put that seed in my head, were saying, well, it's been a drought. And in the old days, when I was a kid, I took my uncle's F-250 Ford pickup up there, with the keg or whatever. But nowadays, there's been a lot of people using it, and a lot of erosion and meow, meow, meow. But then the kind of consensus was, well, if you did Engineer Pass, you're good to go, because everyone was like,
tested.
Oh yeah, because everyone was just freaked out. They're like, oh yeah, they're talking about, Teller County or whatever that place is, are talking about even closing that route. Just like there's another route that was on the backcountry discovery, is like a black route and stuff, is that it's limited to people with permits that are these like 4-wheel drive companies, which I super recommend people take, actually, is that take your street bike and don't do what I did and punish your body and break your machine and hurt yourself. Is pay somebody. It's nominal. It's like $75 for several hours, and these guys' skill set now, and then you can just enjoy life and the scenery and have the adventure and climb glaciers and go straight up and straight down and not hurt yourself. And that's, kids, don't try this at home. Pay a professional and have them take you there, and you'll enjoy it better. And they even have commentary and shit. But nope. So I forgot by the next morning that I barely made it over Engineer Pass, and those last couple miles was a near-death experience. And I just thought, well, if I can do Engineering Pass, I can do this. Not being honest with myself, is that no, I barely made it over Engineering Pass, and it was just sheer luck that I didn't die. And now this is, and then once you get really committed, there's a Tomboy Road or something, but when you really get up into Imogene, if it gets gnarly, I can always turn around and go back. No, you can't. You can't turn around on these things. On a 40-degree scree slope on a single track shit. That's what you're doing. That's what you're doing this afternoon. Yeah. And so, as you kind of know, or whatever, I guess it's in the story or whatever. But so right at the top of, I can see the saddle where Imogene Pass, and it was super clear. It was when you're up in the scree, way above the tree line. It was just this heavenly, amazing day. And I can see the trail before me, and I had about another mile and a half. And I could see the sign and some people in side-by-sides taking pictures and all of that stuff. And I was screaming and calling up this to this day, that it's like one of these hill climb things in Indiana or whatever that they do. It truly was, where I'm like lean forward with the chin bar of my full face helmet practically touching the triple tree of my handlebars, man. My stomach is completely laid over the top of my tank bag, and that bike is like vertical, man. And I have it like started in second gear, and I was able to just punch it down to first with a clutch almost pulled in and the throttle almost fucking pegged, man. And it was going, and it was digging so deep, and I was sliding sideways and knocking pebbles everywhere. And all of a sudden, right at the moment where the final top of this thing goes flat, and I have maybe a quarter mile left of the entire trail to the summit sign over there, and it's and my front tire is on the flat, and my back tire is skidding up to the top of the final top of the hill. All of a sudden, the bike went just like that. Like, what the fuck? Like, the whole engine completely cut out. Like, what? I did nothing. I didn't anything. And what I could figure later on is that the difference between that 640 and the newer 500 EXCF, proper enduro, is the newer version is injection, whereas the older one's a carburetor. And there's a lot to be said about sometimes carburetors. And what I'm thinking is at this point, I must have been at about 14,000 feet, maybe 13,007 or something like that, because it's 14,200 and something at the top of that pass. So I'm getting into the second atmosphere or whatever they do those. And I got a feeling that this bike, the first time its little mapping thing, because it was a relatively new motorcycle, I bought it for the TAD. It only had a couple 100 miles on it when I started the trip, just enough to break it in. Anyway, I think it tried to remap itself. And because I talked to other people, like, what could I have done different? Like, God, foreshadow what happened when I was laying in the hospital with plenty of time to think about this. Man, I've been in a couple wars and all of this stuff, and I don't have like bad dreams, but this was one that I must have dreamed that moment for 6 months, and in each time there's this problem set where like it's kind of like those Roadrunner and Coyote or Bugs Bunny and ones where they run and they run off the cliff, and then there's these little high notes, xylophone, tink 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 tink, and then they stop, and then they look left and they look right, and then they look up and then they look down, and then they see that, and then they fall.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened to me. Is I stopped in midair, and for like 1 second or 1 hour, I was exactly stopped, completely at a 45-degree angle, and I started to slide backwards. And there's nothing more horrifying than going upwards on your own momentum. And even though all circuits are engaged to do that, despite the fact that your engine is on, you're going fucking backwards. And there's nothing more horrific than that feeling in your gut, like this is not going to end well. This is horrible. That almost like an elevator kind of in your stomach. You're like, so yes. So the bike stalls. It takes me a second to just figure out why I'm not moving anymore. And then that second makes me start to go backwards. So I pull the clutch all the way in, and with my thumb, I'm trying to mash it. But when you pull your clutch all the way in and the engine is off, you go backwards fast. So I'm like, fucking, of course, we already discussed the evil rear brake of the 2020 model EFE CX blah thing. And so my back brake was cooked. I put it all the way down and nothing was biting. And so I had to pull in the front brake as I'm going backwards. I'm moving backwards. And I pull in the front brake, but now my front tire has left the level, and now it's going down. And so my front tire locked up, because even with all that,
all the weight's in the back. Yeah.
And I'm going backwards. And so I'm trying with my neck to figure out, how am I going backwards? Am I going backwards off a 13,000 foot fucking cliff that goes all the way down to a river below? Or am I going backwards into the sort of the ridge that's sort of to my left? And with my full face helmet and my jacket on and my little water bottle-y thing, and I can't turn my head. Plus I'm trying to get the bike started. There's a lot of multitasking happening right here. And in my dream, it was always this, because then the bike started, thank God, the bike started first button push. It was like, boom. I mean, it was already primed. I was supposed to be going. The bike was like, yeah, why did you shut me off? Like, so I started, I'm trying to go, but now here's the one. I still dream about this. Do I let go the brake, which I wanted to do because my front tire was locked and I was losing control. I was sideways, but to get power, I got to let go of the clutch. But you let go them both at the same time. Oh, and I'm trying to feather my throttle with just the bottom part of the palm of my hand, because my fingers are wrapped around the fucking, brake.
Yeah.
So whatever that sequence was supposed to be, meanwhile, my body is twisted around because I'm looking over my shoulder to think, okay, if I'm just going straight back, that's fine. I can kind of, let go of some of the motion, and I have but if I'm right on the edge of the cliff, I'm going to have to take more drastic action. Although I don't know, it takes me longer to explain all this than how it all happened very, very quickly. So anyway, I think the act of me kind of twisting around to try to see where the hell I was going backwards, and I was going to sort of put my foot down because I was starting to go sideways because my front tire was locked up. And here's another one. I could have put my left foot down. I could have put my right foot down. And again, in my dream, I tried different ways, and for whatever reason, I put my right foot down because it was already bent forward because I had my brake all the way maxed down on there. And so I just kind of lifted off the brake and then tried to put it down, but I didn't look down because I'm looking sideways anyway. But it turns out I was actually going kind of diagonally down the mountain. And so if I would have put my left leg, I would have touched dirt like in 6 inches. But because it was on the steep side that I put my leg down, my leg, instead of hitting the ground, kept going. So wow. I basically pushed my bike sideways because my foot kind of fell through the floorboards, as it were. And right when I let go of all the shit to give it gas, and so I just slid sideways with a wheelie upside down, and I had a tabular fracture of my tib fib, and I had to be evacuated off the fucking mountain, and my bike sat up there for a couple of days. That's a whole other podcast, and we should have that one about how to get a bike off the 13,000 foot mountain that you got to hike up. And that was very interesting, getting the bike back. Well, with a broken leg.
So basically at the top of Imogene Pass, you have fallen over and broken your leg, and now you've got to get basically rescued, taken down the mountain.
Yeah, with my tail between my legs and a shock, because we began this whole thing about how I wasn't sure I could do it and this, but then I owned it, and I just did Engineer Pass, and in 5 seconds I was going to do Imogene Pass, which will be literally from that mountain pass, it's all downhill all the way to Port Orford, Oregon. I will never go higher. I will never go harder. Every single thing after that will be better and easier and cooler. And that was it. And I was at that moment. I could taste victory. I could see the friggin' sign while I was laying there in the dirt. I could see the finish line, man. It was just like, oh God. And yeah,
dude, that's a heartbreaker, man. I feel for you, because you had come a long ways. You had, like I said, you had done your on the job training there on the trail in the mud. So, all right, you've been on the TAT, you break your leg. Let's sort of so you get down the mountain. What happens next? Let's get us back to what.
Yeah. So back
next.
to the TAT. So again, the whole medical. I'll maybe write an article or we'll talk about some other. It's a good, interesting story about the whole medical thing and getting there. Montrose, the hospital, and blah 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 blah. I was stuck there. I was splayed. My leg was. I can show you the pictures. It was like that. So I got home, even get home, because right after major surgery, with blood clots and this and that, plus you got to rent out like 4 seats to lay, because my leg was really messed. I messed that leg up bad. But pause. And the last thing about medical is, if you have to have a major tabular fracture of your tib fib, get it done in Western Colorado. Yes, sirree, Bob. Is that I ended up in Colorado Springs at this amazing surgery. And it's one of these I do 16 tib fibs before I have my first cup of coffee. It's the mountain bike capital of the world. It services Aspen and Moab. And so these guys, instead of if you've ever been in a hospital with a motorcycle injury, and sadly I could tell a couple stories in that regard, there's always a moment in the hospital, whether it's an orderly or often it's the surgeon themselves, that go out of the way to visit you in the hospital bed and shit all over you because of your personal choice of conveyance that you were on when you broke your shit. Yeah. And they lecture you about, I spent 4 hours putting you back together. Are you going to sit there and, blah, blah, you're going to ride again? And everyone it's just kind of awful. You got to defend yourself, and you're in the hospital. However, in the Colorado one was, oh, what happened to him? As they're wheeling you in the gurney, and they're like, oh, he tried to take his KTM up over the top of Imogene Pass. And the other guy's, oh, badass, man. Which model, And they're like, oh, dude. And everyone's talking about gnarly bike stories, and everyone, even all of the staff, the surgeons, because figure they're all young people out there. And who moves out there to work except people that are into outdoor activity? Western Colorado is full.
Skiers and snowboarders and mountain bikers and motorcyclists and all that stuff. So,
yeah, the whole town is full of the EMT guys, the people on the trail. The entire chain of custody until I got plunked back down in New Orleans was full of all outdoorsy, supportive, awesome people that were, yeah. So kind of that part was if this crap, and then I reflected on it when I had to do all my follow-up with my local surgeons and skin grafty people and all those things, is that good doctors, but they do one of those a year or something, you know, and these guys, that's all they do. So again, if you have to get hurt.
What time of year was did you basically have your crash on Imogene Pass? Was it late September?
No, it was in October.
Oh,
and that's another one, is that I was still non-weight bearing. I had to rent one of those Craftmatical adjustable bed from one of these medical supply, and they put it. Of course, I live in the Winchester Mystery House. I'm in Southern Louisiana, baby. My house is 16 foot up in the air on stilts. My whole house is nothing but stilts and stairs and firemen's poles and shit, you know. And so I think, what the hell? So my friends had to carry my carcass and plop it on this rented bed, and for a month I lived in my living room, and I had to have people deliver me food because I couldn't physically enter. And that's when Hurricane Zeta hit.
Oh, so shit.
It wasn't like I'm ballsy. I live, you know, it's like, what's that Clash song? London is drowning and I live by the river, man. It's like, it's a class 2 hurricane coming and I'm right on the water. You know, surge, predicted 10 to 12 feet. I'm like, well, I'm 16 foot up, you know? And so, and I would have evacuated, but I wasn't going anywhere because I was in a fucking hospital bed in my living room. It was awful, man. So that was that tat.
So let's fast forward. So basically,
the tat. Let's go back to the tat.
So how did you get back to the tat? And so at what time? How many months later did you get back?
Well, I'm gonna finish the thing because the dreams that I kept having is sometimes I make it. I pop the clutch and there was the sign. And then the other one too is that all the Waray people in that pool were like, "Well, you did engineer," but they were saying, "Well, because Telluride is the more popular, famous-y, touristy place." And that's where the headquarters of all those like 4-wheel drive places are. And so they're like, oh yeah, a friend of mine in like a Subaru Outback or something made it from the Telluride side. And it was the hard side is the Waray side. It's like the whole way is like 30 something miles, let's say, and maybe 20 of them or more are from Waray to the summit. So it's just a thing. So I just thought, well, fuck, I mean, I made it, you know, the hardest part ever. I did engineer pass. I did that. I crossed all them water obstacles and all of that crap. Then Utah is going to be challenging, but man, I did all the high country and Utah just be more of the same, but less altitude, you know? So I thought, and at the time I thought the last big challenge that I was really afraid of, because it was fundamentally different than the water crossings and the rocky passes, was the Great Basin. You know, most of Nevada, half of Oregon, and a sizable chunk of Idaho and Utah is this sort of like an American Sahara Desert. Everybody thinks about the Southwest and those Mojave Desert or the Gila Desert and all this, but the Great Basin is something to be respected and feared. It's one of the largest expanses of unpopulated parts of the lower 48. And it's a lot of sand and it's a lot of empty shit. I mean, there'll be some Native American in his mini truck looking for a sheep maybe once every 10 days on some of those roads. And also, even on the Sam's, he has a mark on there. It's the largest that goes from Idaho through part of Oregon, is the longest part of the TAT without any fuel or possibilities of stops or paved roads or anything. It's like 200 and something miles. Wow. And so that's one where earlier people talk about bike and the whole things are written about, you know, bike choices. And, you know, the rule of thumb is a bike that you can lift up unassisted on your own. That's my definition, because you will definitely fall down. And I fell down a shitload of times until I broke my leg.
So where did you get back? Where did you get back on the TAT? I mean,
well, that's what I'm going to. So, and so how I bet is that, but the one thing about the Great Basin, so that was the only, so when I'm in the hospital bed and then I'm riding out hurricanes in my living room and my rent-a-bed, and then I was on a walker until almost Thanksgiving, and then I was on a cane through like January, and my physical therapy, I had pretty good insurance or whatever, and that lasted and through like March, and then it was French Quarter Fest and Jazz Fest. It was like standing around and walking around. It was kind of like made me more agile or whatever. That was my training, you know. And then, meanwhile, I had to leave the motorcycle in friggin' in a gal I know who has a place in Colorado Springs. So that thing was cryogenically frozen and left in her garage. All my luggage, all my dirty fucking sleeping bag, and all of that shit, all my supply, everything was there. And so But all I did was eat, breathe, and shit and think about the tat. And I doubled down on the maps and I watch a bunch and I'm going to do this shit. And because I'm maybe a little bit OCD or HD, go whatever these ones are, is that it's like, and I'm going to start at exactly where I left off. You know, is that because already it was a big blow to like not do it in one. You know, lots and lots of guys, just like the Appalachian Trail is, you know, they like I ran into that group that was just doing Arkansas. They were from Alabama or something, and that every year they just do one state, or like if there's a little bunch of states, like one thing, and they're working their way, and they finally, and so it's taken them. It's been 4 years, and now they were going to Arkansas, and that's neat. There's many, many ways people can run their tat, you know, and it's your own journey. But for me, a big, huge part of it was I wanted to be a through hiker. You know what I mean? That I wanted to sit there in Port Orford and think, God, these, you know, this bike and me have, and what I, you know, that was a big, big, big part of it. So it was so shocking that minutes, seconds, you know, the clutch versus the brake, you know, and God dang, you know, and so I still had a lot of adrenaline. I'm a lot more lazy just as 1 year later, but, you know, and so I'm doing this, I'm doing it, and I'm going to start at exactly where I left off, and I'm going to go to Port Orford. And, but to do the routing, because the problem is that KTM is an amazing machine, arguably or inarguably to me. I guess the Husqvarna, it's the same basic layout, but just some tweakier things. But it's the finest off-road machine for a 200-something pound guy. It's just perfect. It's power, but feels and weighs like a 250. Because originally I was looking at 250 and thought, well, I'm a fat guy, I need like 350. And then I went to the KTM place, and the engine and the frames are the same from 250 all the way up to 500. Yeah. So you're getting a 250 just with a bigger ass piston, but it weighs, it's like 30-pound difference. So it's an awesome bike. However, it has a little dinky ass fucking race tank that's like, you know, 2.1 gallons or some shit. So online, I ordered the Acer Beast, like whatever. But then again, with COVID and stuff, and so there was another company that made a bigger tank, blah, 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 blah. But in terms of route choice I could not go 200, because again, when you look at mileage, it's second gear with the clutch in halfway, you know, like you don't get a lot of miles out of that shit. Yeah. You can be half a tank and you're gone 15 miles, you know what I mean? Because you're fucking going up and down and sideways and shit. So, and God forbid you make a mistake. Fuck, one 5-10 mile mistake. And even the GPS shows you're right. And then all of a sudden you see this body of water, and then you look down, and then the GPS then vouchsafes to move over to your lost shit. So you're like, oh, fuck, thank you, satellite, you know? And so you're 10, 15 miles. That's 30 miles, my friend. And at 20 miles an hour now, oh, shit, you're only 2/3 of what you thought, and it's getting dark. And you're in the gnarly stuff. You know what I mean? So, and I'm by myself. See, that's another one. Like when Rick helped me with all those brake shit. So I was afraid of the Great Basin, even though there was more, you know, fisticuff, faceplant, horrible dismemberment shit that's worse. And this is just sandy shit. But also sand is hard, and hard for me. I found out that when I did that little beach jump in the very, very beginning of the trip, and that's another reason why I went down to those sand dunes in Oklahoma, is that I was kind of half practicing for I wanted to see, could I do the Lawrence of Arabia shit? And it's a fundamentally different kind of riding.
Sand is its own thing, man. Brain on, gas off, or gas on, brain off. You know, you just you overthink it and you get yourself in trouble. So, yeah.
And the flip side of that too is that's fine. And then an hour later, suddenly there's some kind of arroyo or some old, you know, cowboy era fence post shit. Yeah. And I know lots of people have broken themselves on the tat during those things, because for 2 hours you're in this wallow half pressure tire shit. And then, but all of a sudden there's this terrain feature that jumps at you, you know, and,
so the suspense is killing me, man. So did you actually ride that Yankee Boy Trail and over Imogene Pass again?
Yes, I did. So, but this time, and now this is another kind of a whole little sub chapter. That's what the news story is going to be about. Is that so we talked briefly philosophically about like riding with somebody else versus riding by yourself. Right. Well, I was trying to think of like a third way, and so I found a buddy of mine that I'd known from this long story Burning Man thing from, you know, when I was in DC, and he lives in Philly. and he just happened to be between job, right timing thing. And so I had my Jeep Wrangler and my old TJ and a little pop-up trailer.
Yeah.
And so, because that's the other one, is that I had to go to Colorado Springs to get my bike. I don't want to talk too much about logistics like I did last time, but frankly, the TAT is, what's that Woody Allen said? 90% of success is showing up. Yeah. I would argue, like military, like the long tail of it is planning for the TAT, getting the right shit, knowing how it works, having your vehicle that you know how to ride and all of that shit, and then getting it to the location and getting it out of the location is most of the TAT. And then the rest of it is just this enjoyable fucking movie that you get to watch, And so even all the life and death shit, just getting there and getting out of there. So that was a large thing. So I had to take my fucking Jeep and drive it from New Orleans to Colorado Springs. And I flew my buddy from Philly to Colorado Springs. And then we went over and we picked up the bike. And then I went down to Montrose. Oh, because that's another one, is that this area, like we talked about Moab, it's one of the few that you actually have to make reservations there in like Cape Hatteras and stuff, no matter what time of year, that you can't just, and they don't let you free camp out there. And that's really hard logistically as well. And that bike had been sitting there with the same tank of gas in it for a year. And so I had to find a place that could basically rotor-rooter it and set it up. But all of those places, plenty of off-road KTM places in Western Colorado, that's the bike of choice out there. But they were booked up. They're like, oh, dude, I'm not taking orders until Thanksgiving kind of shit. I mean, literally.
Yeah.
And I did not anticipate that at all. So that was another fucking nail biter. But I found these really groovy people that deserve a way shout out down in Montrose, this little independent place right there kind of by the freeway. Very cool, young people that run it. And I told them what I was doing.
Well, folks, sorry this episode came to such an abrupt end. During this interview, Dave was sitting on his outdoor patio in Slidell, Louisiana, with his phone on a table. The midday sun caused his phone to overheat and shut down, ending our call. We'll have a part 3 interview with Dave, and I hope we'll be able to get to the rest of his story. Thanks for your patience and for listening to the show. If you've enjoyed listening to the Rider Magazine Insider Podcast, please subscribe, leave us a positive rating, and tell your friends. We also encourage you to visit ridermagazine.com, where you can get the latest in motorcycle news and reviews and sign up for our free weekly newsletter. You can also subscribe to print and digital editions of Rider Magazine, which is published 12 times a year. Thanks again for listening.